The House Judiciary Committee hearing room maintained its atmosphere of heightened scrutiny as members assembled to question former Attorney General William Barr regarding his tenure at the Department of Justice and decisions that had generated substantial controversy about the politicization of federal law enforcement. Jasmine Crockett sat among her Democratic colleagues, having spent weeks preparing for this testimony, by reviewing thousands of pages of Department of Justice documents, Inspector General reports, and contemporaneous communications that had been obtained through congressional subpoena power. Barr occupied the witness chair with the confident demeanor of someone who had navigated countless congressional hearings throughout his decades in government service, appearing ready to defend his record as Attorney General during a politically turbulent period. The hearing had proceeded through initial questioning about various matters when discussion turned to Barr's handling of specific investigations and prosecutions that critics charged had been improperly influenced by political considerations rather than being conducted according to neutral law enforcement principles. What transpired during the exchange that followed would represent one of the most significant moments of accountability for actions taken during Barr's controversial tenure, and would demonstrate how thorough documentary evidence could overcome even the most forceful denials from powerful officials accustomed to operating without meaningful oversight. Before examining this critical confrontation that exposed the gap between official representations and documented reality regarding politicized law enforcement decisions, please indicate your location in the comments and subscribe to ensure comprehensive coverage of these oversight proceedings that determine whether senior officials face genuine accountability for actions that undermine justice system integrity and public confidence in impartial law enforcement. William Barr had established himself over several decades as a prominent figure in Republican legal circles, having previously served as Attorney General under President George H.W. Bush before returning to lead the Department of Justice during the Trump administration. His second tenure as Attorney General had been marked by decisions that generated intense controversy regarding whether the department was functioning as an independent law enforcement agency or as a political instrument serving presidential interests. Critics pointed to his handling of the Mueller investigation report, his intervention in sentencing recommendations for political allies of the president, his deployment of federal law enforcement against protesters, and his public statements about election security that contradicted assessments from his own department's experts. Barr consistently defended his actions as reflecting proper exercise of Attorney General authority and appropriate exercise of prosecutorial discretion rather than representing improper political interference in law enforcement decisions. The hearing focused particularly on Barr's role in intervening in the sentencing of a high-profile political figure who had been convicted of crimes including lying to Congress and witness tampering. Career prosecutors had recommended a sentencing range consistent with federal guidelines based on the nature and severity of the offenses, but senior political appointees at the Department of Justice had overruled those recommendations and submitted a revised filing seeking substantially reduced punishment. The 4 career prosecutors handling the case had withdrawn from the matter in protest of this extraordinary intervention, with one resigning from the department entirely. Barr had publicly defended the intervention as a routine exercise of supervisory authority to correct what he characterized as an excessive sentencing recommendation, though legal experts and former department officials had noted that such direct intervention by the Attorney General in an individual sentencing matter was highly unusual and raised serious concerns about political interference in the justice system. Jasmine Crockett had reviewed extensive documentation regarding the sentencing intervention, including internal department communications, Inspector General findings, and testimony from career prosecutors who had worked on the case. Her preparation had revealed significant discrepancies between Barr's public explanations for the intervention and what internal documents demonstrated about the decision-making process and the actual basis for overruling career prosecutor recommendations. She understood that effectively challenging Barr's account would require presenting documentary evidence that contradicted his statements, rather than simply asserting alternative interpretations of events that he could dismiss as partisan speculation. The hearing had proceeded through several hours of testimony when Crockett received recognition to question the former Attorney General. She began by asking Barr to explain the basis for his decision to intervene in the sentencing recommendation for the convicted political figure. Barr responded that he had reviewed the initial sentencing memorandum and had determined that the recommended sentence was excessive given the nature of the offenses, and that reducing the recommendation represented appropriate exercise of supervisorial responsibility to ensure consistent and fair application of sentencing policies across cases. Crockett followed by asking whether Barr had consulted with the career prosecutors who had handled the investigation and trial before deciding to overrule their sentencing recommendation. Barr responded that he had received input from senior department officials who had reviewed the matter, and that such consultation was adequate for making an informed decision about appropriate sentencing positions. Crockett noted that he had not answered whether he consulted with the actual prosecutors who possessed detailed knowledge of the case facts, and asked him to clarify whether he had spoken with them before intervening. Barr stated somewhat defensively that he was not required to consult with line prosecutors before making supervisorial decisions, and that he had adequate information to make a determination about appropriate sentencing recommendations. Crockett observed that while he might not be legally required to consult prosecutors, his failure to do so before overruling their professional judgment raised questions about whether his decision was based on thorough understanding of case facts or on other considerations. She asked whether he disputed that the career prosecutors possessed more detailed knowledge of the case than he did, given that they had conducted the investigation and trial, while he had not been involved until deciding to intervene in sentencing. The former Attorney General responded that his role as Attorney General gave him authority and responsibility for all department prosecutions, and that he did not need to defer to line prosecutors' views when he determined that different positions were appropriate. This response confirmed that he had not consulted with the prosecutors before overruling them, while attempting to characterize such consultation as unnecessary, given his supervisorial authority. Crockett noted his answer and proceeded to the line of questioning that would expose the fundamental dishonesty in his account. She asked Barr whether he had communicated with the White House about the case before deciding to intervene in the sentencing recommendation. Barr responded emphatically that he had not discussed the matter with the president and that his decision had been based solely on his independent assessment of appropriate sentencing policy. Crockett asked him to clarify whether he was stating that he had no communications with anyone at the White House regarding the case before intervening. Barr reiterated that he had made his decision independently without improper influence from the White House. Crockett then asked whether Barr was aware that the committee had obtained his phone records and White House visitor logs through subpoena. She noted that these records documented multiple communications between him and White House officials in the days immediately preceding his intervention in the sentencing recommendation. She asked whether he wished to revise his testimony regarding White House communications before she presented specific evidence from those records. Barr's demeanor shifted noticeably as he processed the implication that documentary evidence contradicted his statements. He attempted to clarify that he might have had routine communications with White House officials about various matters, but that such communications did not mean that the sentencing decision was influenced by those conversations. Crockett noted that he had just testified unequivocally that he had not discussed the matter with the White House before, now suggesting that communications might have occurred but were routine and unrelated. She proceeded to present evidence that would devastate Barr's credibility and expose his testimony as deliberately misleading. She displayed phone records showing that Barr had received calls from the White House counsel's office on 3 occasions during the 48 hours before he intervened in the sentencing recommendation. She noted that these calls had occurred immediately after the president had publicly criticized the initial sentencing recommendation as excessive and had called for Department of Justice intervention. She asked whether Barr maintained that these communications were routine and unrelated to the sentencing matter, given their timing immediately following presidential criticism and immediately preceding his intervention. Barr attempted to respond that he could not recall the specific substance of those conversations and that they might have addressed various matters rather than focusing specifically on the sentencing case. Crockett observed that his inability to recall conversations that occurred in such suspicious timing and that related to a matter generating intense public controversy raised serious credibility concerns. She noted that career prosecutors, who had far less reason to remember specific conversations, had provided detailed contemporaneous accounts of events, while he claimed not to recall communications that appeared directly relevant to his subsequent controversial decision. She then presented additional evidence from White House visitor logs showing that Barr had met in person with senior White House officials during the same time period and that meeting notes indicated that the sentencing matter had been discussed. She displayed excerpts from those notes showing that White House officials had expressed concern about the sentencing recommendation and had indicated that the president wanted the department to intervene to seek reduced punishment. She asked Barr whether this documentary evidence refreshed his recollection about whether he had discussed the sentencing case with White House officials before deciding to intervene. The former Attorney General appeared visibly uncomfortable as he struggled to reconcile his testimony with the documentary evidence that Crockett was systematically presenting. He attempted to suggest that simply discussing the case with White House officials did not constitute improper influence, and that he had ultimately made his own independent decision about appropriate sentencing positions. However, this response effectively conceded that his earlier testimony denying White House communications had been false, while attempting to minimize the significance of those communications. Crockett pressed further by noting that Barr had not simply failed to disclose White House communications, but had affirmatively denied them when asked directly. She stated that this pattern of testimony, followed by documentary contradiction, raised serious questions about whether other aspects of his account were similarly misleading. She asked whether he acknowledged that he had provided false testimony to the committee about White House communications regarding the sentencing intervention. Barr objected strenuously to the characterization of his testimony as false, insisting that any lack of clarity resulted from imprecise questions or misunderstanding rather than intentional deception. However, Crockett methodically reviewed the exchange, showing that she had asked specifically whether he had communicated with the White House about the case and that he had stated unequivocally that he had not before documentary. Evidence forced him to acknowledge that such communications had in fact occurred. She noted that this sequence of denial, followed by grudging acknowledgement when confronted with evidence, represented exactly the pattern that characterized false testimony designed to mislead investigators while preserving technical deniability if contradicted by documents. She then presented evidence addressing the substance of Barr's justification for intervening in the sentencing recommendation. He had claimed that the initial recommendation was excessive and inconsistent with department sentencing policies. Crockett displayed internal department analyses from career prosecutors, showing that the initial recommendation fell well within the range of sentences imposed in comparable cases, and that it was consistent with federal sentencing guidelines and department policies. She presented communications from senior career officials stating that they saw no basis for characterizing the recommendation as excessive and expressing concern that the intervention appeared to be politically motivated rather than reflecting genuine policy concerns. She asked Barr whether he disputed the factual accuracy of these internal assessments from career department officials with expertise in sentencing policy. He responded that he had access to different information and had reached different conclusions about what constituted appropriate sentencing in this case. Crockett noted that he had just acknowledged that career experts with detailed case knowledge had reached conclusions contradicting his position, but that he had overruled them without being able to identify specific factual errors in their analysis or policy standards that they had misapplied. She observed that the evidence pattern suggested that his intervention had been driven by White House pressure following presidential criticism, rather than by independent assessment of sentencing policy as he had claimed. She noted that the timing of White House communications, his intervention immediately following those communications, despite career prosecutor assessments that the initial recommendation was appropriate, his initial false testimony denying White House contacts, and his inability to identify substantive basis for contradicting career expert assessments, all supported the conclusion that his actions had represented improper political interference in the justice system, rather than legitimate exercise of supervisorial authority. The committee room had fallen into profound silence as members absorbed the systematic evidentiary dismantling of Barr's testimony. Republican members appeared uncomfortable, recognizing that documentary evidence had exposed serious credibility problems in the former Attorney General's account, while Democratic members leaned forward with evident satisfaction at seeing accountability established through thorough investigation and strategic presentation of contradictory evidence. Barr himself appeared diminished, his initial confidence replaced by defensive posture as the gap between his representations and documented reality had been exposed before the committee and viewing public. Chairman Jerry Nadler intervened to note that the evidence presented raised extremely serious concerns about the former Attorney General's truthfulness and about the politicization of law enforcement decisions during his tenure. He indicated that the committee would be referring the matter to the Department of Justice Inspector General for investigation of whether Barr's testimony constituted perjury and would be examining whether additional evidence existed of political interference in other prosecutorial decisions. He thanked Crockett for her thorough investigation and presentation of evidence that had illuminated matters of critical importance for understanding how the Department of Justice had functioned during a period when its independence appeared to have been seriously compromised. The immediate aftermath saw extensive media coverage focusing on the evidentiary contradictions that Crockett had exposed in Barr's testimony. Legal experts noted that the documentary evidence of White House communications immediately preceding the sentencing intervention, combined with Barr's initial false denial of those communications, created strong basis for concluding that his actions had been improperly influenced by political considerations. Former Department of Justice officials from both parties expressed concern that the evidence confirmed fears that prosecutorial decisions had been subjected to political interference in ways that undermined public confidence in impartial justice. Progressive organizations celebrated Crockett's systematic investigation and presentation as demonstrating how effective congressional oversight could establish accountability even for powerful officials who attempted to obscure their actions through misleading testimony. They noted that her success stemmed from thorough documentary investigation that provided evidence contradicting Barr's account rather than relying on assertions that he could dismiss as partisan speculation. The exchange provided a model for how oversight should function when investigating potential abuse of power by senior officials. Some conservative commentators attempted to defend Barr by suggesting that communications with the White House did not necessarily prove improper influence and that attorneys general routinely consulted with administration officials about department decisions. However, these defenses struggled to explain why Barr had initially denied the communications if they were routine and proper, or to reconcile his intervention with the documented assessments from career prosecutors that the initial sentencing recommendation was appropriate and consistent with department policies. The documentary evidence that Crockett had presented became the focus of subsequent investigations by the Department of Justice Inspector General and by legal ethics authorities examining whether Barr's conduct violated professional responsibility standards. Several state bar associations opened inquiries into whether his actions warranted disciplinary proceedings given the apparent political interference in prosecutorial decisions and his misleading testimony to Congress about those actions. The evidentiary foundation that Crockett had established ensured that these investigations would proceed from documented facts rather than from conflicting accounts that officials under investigation could contest. For William Barr personally, the hearing represented a significant blow to his reputation and his legacy as Attorney General. The documentary evidence of White House communications that he had initially denied, combined with evidence that career prosecutors had concluded that his sentencing intervention lacked substantive justification, seriously undermined his claims that his tenure had been characterized by independent professional judgment rather than political service to the president. The viral nature of the exchange ensured that this accountability moment would be prominently featured in assessments of his time leading the Department of Justice. For Jasmine Crockett, the hearing elevated her reputation as one of Congress's most effective oversight practitioners. Her performance demonstrated the importance of thorough investigation to obtain documentary evidence before conducting public questioning, strategic sequencing of questions to establish contradictions between testimony and documents, and clear presentation that made complex evidence accessible to general audiences. These capabilities positioned her as a leading figure in congressional efforts to establish accountability for abuses of power, and ensured that her participation in future oversight activities would be viewed as adding substantial credibility and effectiveness to investigative efforts. The broader implications extended to questions about how congressional oversight could function effectively to establish accountability when senior officials provided misleading testimony. The hearing demonstrated that obtaining documentary evidence through aggressive use of subpoena power was essential because such evidence could contradict false testimony in ways that mere questioning could not achieve. The exchange illustrated that effective oversight required substantial investigative resources and strategic planning, rather than simply holding hearings where officials repeated rehearsed talking points that could not be effectively challenged without contradictory documentation. Thanks for watching this critical oversight hearing where Jasmine Crockett used systematic documentary evidence to expose fundamental dishonesty in former Attorney General Bill Barr's testimony about political interference in Department of Justice prosecutorial decisions. This exchange demonstrates how effective congressional accountability requires thorough investigation to obtain contradictory evidence rather than relying on questioning alone when officials provide misleading accounts of their actions. Please subscribe immediately and enable notifications to receive comprehensive coverage of ongoing oversight activities and accountability proceedings that determine whether senior officials face genuine consequences for abusing their positions and providing false testimony to Congress. Share your assessment in the comments regarding this confrontation and whether the documentary evidence that Crockett presented established that Barr engaged in improper political interference in prosecutorial decisions and provided false testimony about his actions. Our coverage will track all developments and investigations stemming from this hearing and will examine how the evidentiary standards demonstrated in this exchange influence future congressional oversight of potential abuses of power by senior officials who attempt to obscure their actions through misleading public statements and congressional testimony.